Folks, my name is Joseph. I am the community pastor here on staff. It is so good to be here with you today. You guys doing good? Okay, yeah, hang in there, because this one's a doozy. All right, I want to start today by highlighting what I think is one of the greatest tensions in the Christian faith. I'm going to share a thought with you and see if it maybe sparks any tensions that you feel. When bad things happen, we turn to God for comfort, believing, I think genuinely believing, that God could have prevented those bad things from happening in the first place. Ooh, you feel a little tension there? Let me just restate that. Yeah. When bad things happen, when the chips are down, when things are going sideways, we turn to God, we look to God, we long for comfort from God, while also at the same time, almost with the same breath, recognizing God's goodness, His sovereignty, His kingship, His power. And where does that leave us? Kind of leaves us in a place of tension. I don't know about you. That's a tension that I have lived out and experienced in my own life. I know that not only for myself, but even for people I pray for. You know, when they're hurting, when they're mourning, when they're going through hardship, I pray for them to turn towards God, to look to God for comfort, even though I know that God could have prevented that hardship and that source of tragedy in the first place. We do this. Do you feel that tension? Why do we do this? Are we crazy? Some people think so. Are we irrational? Are we naive? On the other hand, there's a big piece of it. It's like, man, when tragedy strikes, when horrible things are happening, we are so lost, we don't really even know what to do other than cry out to God, right? What else can we do instead of just sitting in our grief and our pain and our mourning? So we call out to God, hungry for any kind of comfort in the midst of very real pain. And I wonder if you know of anyone who has navigated that tension before. In fact, I wonder if you know anyone who is in the midst of that pain, in the midst of that tension, has maybe walked away from their faith, has walked away from a relationship with God. To a certain extent, it almost doesn't matter what God does next because of what God didn't do in the first place. You probably know someone who's lived that story and has walked that path. If we're being really honest, I think we should be really honest here on a Sunday. I wonder if that's your story at all. A pain, a source of tragedy or agony that you've experienced in your life, a crisis of faith that you've gone through, and you've kind of, in your heart of hearts, if you're being really honest, you might say to me, Joseph, my faith is hanging by a thread. Like by a thread. I am lost, and I'm calling out to God for comfort, but I'm also wondering, why did He even let me fall into this place in the first place? And I want to do something I normally don't do, but I just want to almost take pastor hat off here for a second and just talk at you for a minute, as a man, as a husband, as a father, and just say, if that's you, or if that's a loved one of yours, hey guys, I get it. I have lived tragedy. I have lived grief, and I've watched loved ones walk through just unspeakable tragedy and who have been left really wondering, man, is my faith going to survive this? Am I going to make it? Is my relationship with God going to make it? And if you have ever felt even a hint of that, I want to tell you something this morning. It's kind of a big theme for this message and for this morning. I want you to hear loudly and clearly, you are not alone. You are not alone. See, we talk so much about faith within the church, and that's a good thing. I think we should talk about faith within the church, but we don't necessarily spend a whole lot of time as churches, as a church family, talking about those places of doubt, those places of uncertainty, those places of tension where we are kind of left wondering, God, are you really there? God, do you really care? So if that's you, you're not alone. A few years back, my wife and I were serving at a church in Colorado, and I was a pastor there, and I was getting to know some of the church members, and this older couple invited me to go hiking with them. And I say, they were older than me. They weren't old, but they were late 60s, early 70s, but they were older than me. I was in my 20s, and they invited me to go hiking with them. I was like, oh, this is like a home run. Sure, yeah, I'll go on a little jaunt. This couple was Colorado natives, though, and so they had grown up hiking 14ers, and they wanted to take me on my first 14er. Now, if you're not from Colorado, you've not heard that term. That's a mountain that's over 14,000 feet in elevation, and they wanted to do 2 of them in the same day. And if you're looking for a big slice of humble pie as a guy in your 20s, go hiking with some Colorado natives, because this was my posture, my position that entire hike. Oh, like dying the whole time. And they are just chugging along, this like wonderful little retired couple. And so I can barely breathe. I can barely think. So I came up with this strategy of like, how in the world am I going to survive this? And so kind of like through gasping breath, I was like, why don't you guys tell me your story? Just tell me your whole story. I'll just listen. I want to be a really good listener right now so I can focus on, not throwing up. And they could just talk. And they did for 10 hours. Who hikes for 10 hours? But for 10 hours, we're on this hike. We're on these 14ers, and they're just telling me their story. And it's actually kind of a cool metaphor because, here we are on this mountaintop with this just great perspective, right? Big perspective, kind of looking out over the valleys and the hills and everything in between, other mountains. Excuse me. And this couple starts sharing their story. They talk about all the highs and all the lows and everything in between. They're talking about career and marriage and falling in love. And they start talking about family. And this couple starts sharing about their children. And they had 3 children, and 2 of them, their 2 daughters, had actually passed away very early on in life, very young. And it was different situations, but very similar circumstances that both of these little girls passed away. And I really don't know any other way to say it other than like the circumstances of their passing were pretty horrific, incredibly tragic. Like not worth me going into, most importantly, because it's not my story to tell, right? It's their story. But also if I share the details, you probably wouldn't hear much of anything else I have to say for the rest of this time. And as they're sharing their story and just through the tears, and I'm feeling just the weight on my soul from their story, I asked the only question like I knew how to ask. I was like, man, how did your faith survive a tragedy like that? Not once, but twice. And they looked at each other and they kind of looked at me and they said, Joseph, I gotta be honest, it didn't. Like our faith didn't make it, but it was the faith that we had kind of grown up with. It was a faith in the traditions of God. It was a faith in these ideas about God and these philosophies of God and even some of these practices of God. That faith that had guided them into marriage and into starting a family and in building their life together, they said that faith just didn't make it. But through just the weeks that you would imagine of just weeping and mourning and heartache, of just waking up in the morning with this just lead ball in your stomach of like, how do I face another day without my little girls? Through years of counseling and processing and prayer and mourning, they said that something incredible happened. Something remarkable happened. They said that their faith actually was restored. But it wasn't the same faith that they had kind of built and experienced their entire life. Because it wasn't about those traditions and those things and those activities of God. It was actually faith rooted in the person of God. The presence of God in their life. All the questions of why and how and what do we do, those kind of faded away and everything came back to who? Who is God? Who is God? Who is God? And they said that out of that tragedy and out of that strife, they had this new faith, this new relationship with God that they shared with one another. And they said, on the one hand, it was deeper and stronger than anything they'd experienced before. But on the other hand, it was a lot more tender. It was a lot more raw. It was a lot more real. And this couple, again, on this mountaintop, talking about one of the deepest, darkest valleys really just about anyone can imagine and go through. They talked about who God is. There is a tension that we live of how in the world do we make sense of a broken and hurting world. And it's one thing when it's out there, like off in the distance, but man, it's a whole nother thing when it's right here, isn't it? It's a whole nother weight that we carry. Or even worse, I think, is when a loved one is walking through that and you don't know how to help them. And you're just longing that they would experience some kind of restoration in their faith like that couple on a mountaintop in Colorado talked about. But you're just not sure if they're going to get there. And folks, you are not alone. You're not alone with those questions, those doubts, those fears. Because I could go on a limb and say that there are people in this room that many of you have mourned something very painful in your life. A loss, a tragedy, abuse that maybe you experienced, and you've mourned the tragedy of what you went through. Or maybe it's a different type of mourning that you've experienced. It's the mourning of something that didn't happen. It was a dream that you had for your life. It was the marriage that you dreamed that you would have. It was the family that you dreamed it would come to be and it never did. But you've either mourned something that hasn't happened or something that has happened, but you've experienced mourning. And I know this is such a heavy message, but I think this is so important because even if that's not you today, and you're like, Joseph, you're so out of the ballpark about my life and my experiences right now, I would say this, not in a mean way, but just in an honest way, because this is a very honest mourning. You will one day. Right, you will one day. If you haven't experienced a mourning like that, you will experience that. And loved ones in your life will experience that. And you have to be able to answer the question, how do I live in this tension between a God who brings comfort, a God who is good, but also a God who's powerful and could have prevented that in the first place? And every faith, every philosophy, every worldview on the planet has one thing in common. Do you know what it is? Every single faith thinks there's something wrong with the world. Every single philosophy, every single worldview. No one looks at the world and says, oh, famine, war, poverty, tragedy, that's good. Things are as they ought to be. That's the one thing that every single faith has in common, every single worldview, perspective, philosophy. But there's a difference in response. And that's actually what I want to sit with us today. There is something unique, there is something special and significant, and I would actually say transformational about the way of Jesus and how we make sense of a broken world in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of God's goodness. There's something different about the way of Jesus. And I want to actually sit with the teachings of Jesus because I think that's a very good place for us to start. You know, we've been in this series called The Pursuit of Happiness. And it's really just talking about the blessed life. And when you hear the good life, the blessed life, you don't think about tragedy, you don't think about loss, you think about wealth and health and prosperity and magazine covers and big cars, fast cars, big houses. You think about the good life in that way, but Jesus was so unique in his perspective because he actually challenged what the human view of the good life really was about. And it's summarized in the Sermon on the Mount. It's his longest sermon, Matthew chapter 5 through 7, longest recorded sermon in Scripture. But this is a very consistent teaching all throughout Jesus' ministry. He was always kind of coming back to these points. He would teach on them regularly. And it would start with this series of phrases called the Beatitudes. That's just from the Latin word for blessing. And Jesus would actually start by looking at a broken and hurting world, people with questions and doubts and fears, like us. And he had a word for them. He said, you actually are blessed. You're blessed. And folks, we love the Beatitudes in the church. If you go to a Christian bookstore, you're seeing Beatitudes everywhere. There's wall art with the Beatitudes on it. That couch your grandma had when you were growing up that had like 30 throw pillows on it, that probably had each of the Beatitudes kind of like crocheted on the side. We love the Beatitudes. This is a hard teaching. It's a heavy teaching. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who mourn. And that's the one we're sitting with today, if you couldn't figure that out already. Blessed are those who mourn. And so Jesus, standing before the crowds and with his disciples, said, you who are mourning, blessed are you who mourn, for you will be comforted. Matthew 5, verse 4. What kind of audacity does Jesus have to say, in the midst of pain, you actually can experience blessing? Better question is, what kind of authority does someone have that they can speak that? That's not really a common thing. You're not going to go to Hallmark and see a lot of, your grandma just passed away. Congratulations. Like, you're not going to see blessed Hallmark cards speaking to loss. And yet, Jesus was so acutely aware of what people actually needed to hear and experience in the midst of the confusion and the chaos and loss of life. But here's what was so significant. Why could Jesus stand up in front of people and say, you are blessed? Jesus himself was the blessing of God. I know that sounds hyper spiritual. Hang with me for just a minute as I explain that. Jesus himself was both the blessing of God to those who are hurting, but also the comfort of God who are hurting. Because you know how we talked about everyone agrees there's stuff that's wrong with the world. There are things that are broken in the world. The response that a Jesus follower has is this, that God was not satisfied with a broken world. He didn't stay on the sidelines. He didn't look at the wall that separated God from humanity and say, well, I'll maybe occasionally throw some blessings over that wall. Maybe I'll have a few people that if they perform really well, I'll favor. But you know what? It's up to them. They got to figure out how to go over or under or around that wall. But I'm going to stay over here. Jesus kicks down that wall. He set aside his majesty. He set aside his glory. He set aside his power. And he stepped into a broken world. And you want to know how he was known and identified? As a man of sorrows. As a man afflicted. He set aside the glory of heaven and took on the nature of a servant. Jesus was the presence of God in our lives. Psalm 34:18 says this, God is near to the brokenhearted. If you've been around the church for a while, you might think, duh, isn't God always near? Isn't that kind of the idea of an omnipresent God, an all-present God, that God is always near? He's always close to us. You can't hide from God. You can't get away from him. You can't, pull the sheets over your head and God's not there anymore. No, he's always there. Yes, but in Jesus, there is something special, a closeness, an affinity, a nearness that God has for folks who are hurting. If you're hurting this morning, if you're doubting this morning, if you're in pain this morning, or you have loved ones who are hurting and doubting and in pain this morning, God is near to them. In fact, he is especially near to the brokenhearted, nearer than our skin, because of the presence of Jesus, because that is his mission, to step into a hurting and dying world and to bring life. God is near to the brokenhearted. And because of that nearness, because of the blessing of Jesus' presence, we can actually say, like the psalmist in Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of what? Shadow of death. Even though I walk through the darkest of valleys, the most pain, the most hurt, the most mourning, even though I walk through those places, and we do, you probably will, I will not fear. I will not fear. Why? Why wouldn't you be afraid somewhere like that? Why should I not be afraid in a place like that? Because my God is with me. My God is with me. My God is with me. And my God is with me. My good shepherd is with me. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and I can trust him, I can look to him. And you want to know what? The good shepherd walks with his sheep through that valley, but the good shepherd lays down his life for those sheep. And because of Jesus, because of the sacrifice of the cross, and because of the empty grave, we both have God's presence and his comfort in the midst of pain and loss. And that is good news, friends. That is what separates Christianity. It's a distinctive of Christianity. God is not afraid to step into the mess and the pain and the hurt and the brokenness of your life. Rejoice in that. And God does not leave you there. For the last half of this message, I actually want us to focus on, it's so good to focus and be reminded of God's presence with us in the midst of hurting, but there actually is a way. Did you know there's a way that we can participate with God? We can actually engage with God in a place of tremendous pain and hurting, and even on the behalf of others. And it's a word that's all throughout Scripture, but we almost never talk about it. I've been a pastor like 12 years. We never talk about this in the church. Do you want to know what that word is? Lament. Hooray. Yeah, I know. You guys sound really excited. Lament. And here's why that word is so significant. Lament is the tool, it is the opportunity for us to actually engage with God in the darkest, coldest, most lonely of places in our faith and our life and our relationships. It's like when the power goes out of your house. Our power went out a few weeks back at our house. And what do you do when the power goes out? What tool instrument do you get? Get a flashlight or you get a candle and you grab on a candle. Lament is that candle that you hold on to when there is no other light in sight. But it is a beautiful, and I mean this, and I'm not just being hyper spiritual about this. Lament is a beautiful tool. It is a resource. It actually is a practice that God invites us to embrace in those dark, shadowy places of life. So I want to talk a little bit about what is lament, what does it actually look like for us to practice lament as individuals, as a church. And the first thing we got to do is say what lament is not. Okay, lament is not complaining. I know in our culture, our day and age, they're synonyms in English language, like, oh man, my dinner was kind of cold. I'm complaining about cold meal at the restaurant, or I'm lamenting a cold meal. Maybe lament is like more dramatic, but it's, maybe everyone's got that relative who's a little bit more dramatic. They might say, lament, I lament this thing. In the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, complaining and lament were very, very different things. Let me say this correctly here. A complaint is an accusation against God where you are attacking his character. But a lament is an appeal to God because of confidence in his character. A lot of words there, but you hear the difference. A complaint is you're putting God on trial. God, I don't trust you. You're up to no good. Why are you doing this? What's your problem? It's inverting the relationship between created and creator. I don't know about you guys. You ever talk back to your parents ever? How'd that go for you? Yeah, it doesn't go well, trust me. How about parents? Your kids ever talk back to you? How's that go for them? Yeah, it doesn't go well. You might put up with it for a while. It does not go well because you're turning that relationship dynamic on its head. That's actually not the way it was meant to be. You actually have no right to put God on trial, to attack his character. But a lament is different. And through a lament, you are actually appealing to God. You're actually asking God to intervene because, God, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why this is happening. I don't even know where you're at right now, God, but I know who you are. I know who you are, and I can trust you, and I'm looking to you, God, and I need you to show up right now. I need you, God. And you know what a lament actually is? Lament is praise. Lament is actually praise. Now, this is very countercultural, I think, for us as North American Christians, because we often think to ourselves, I can't bring my mess to God. I got to kind of fix myself up. I've got to keep it together. I can't bring it to God. I can't bring it to other people. God rejoices when you lament. He delights when you lament. He loves when you come to him, when you turn to him, when you actually take solace in the fact that he is listening and he is good and you're appealing to him based on his character. Did you know there's a book of Lamentations? Again, we don't talk about this very much. If you've ever needed freedom to take your junk to God, there's literally a book called Lamentations. It's in the Old Testament. It's written by this guy named Jeremiah, this prophet. He was known as the weeping prophet because he lived through some stuff. You probably have lived through some stuff, or you know someone who has. And here is what the prophet Jeremiah says. I'm going to kind of jump right into the middle of it. It's a beautiful book. And if you're looking to really dig into what does it mean to be real and authentic and honest with God, man, read Lamentations. Just soak it in. Spend some time. You can read it in a short afternoon. Very quick book. But I'm going to jump right into chapter 3. And I want you to hear how Jeremiah appeals to God's character despite his circumstance. So he starts by describing what's going on. This is Lamentations 3, verse 16. He has broken my teeth with gravel. That's God. He's talking about the way that he feels treated by God. God, you have broken my teeth with gravel. What an awful image. God, you have trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, it's done. My splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Do you ever have something happen, and you just can't not remember it? It sticks with you. It lodges in your chest. And it's like you might be able to put on a smiling face. You might be able to kind of power through it for a little bit for the sake of others. But man, there's something that's just shadowing you day to day throughout your life. That is what Jeremiah is living through. He's actually living through the fall of Jerusalem. He's actually living through watching and believing God's chosen people, the people of God, this holy city that's supposed to be an example to the nations, and he's seeing it torn down, and he's seeing their enemies mock them, and he's seeing people, loved ones, carted off into slavery, and he's left wondering, God, where are you? Are you there? Do you even care? But listen to how this lament changes. The very next verse. I remember them, my soul is downcast within me, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Friends, we can take our pain and our doubts and our fears to God. And you want to know what? He can handle them. He can handle them. God actually receives them as praise. And in the Basil life, praise is a weapon against the enemies of depression and fear and darkness. Praise actually is how we hold on to that candle of hope, even when it seems like there's no chance of the lights ever coming back on. If you're looking for just a way to engage with this idea and dig into it a little bit more, reading through the book of Psalms. We're going to be doing a series on the Psalms and the emotions of the Psalms later this fall. But you can get a jump start. But you know, the book of Psalms is 150 of these things. They're spiritual songs, they're poems. The Hebrew word for the book of Psalms is Tehillim. That means praises, literally. It's a book of praises in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew. Did you know that 100 out of 150 of the Psalms are Psalms of lament? Two-thirds of the Psalms are actually written to God with people pouring out their hearts and appealing to his character from places of hurt and woundedness and pain. And God loves it, he embraces it, he invites it. And you want to know why? Lament is praise, but lament is proof of trust. When you bring your lament to God, it is a proof of trust. My wife and I are night owls. Any night owls in the room? Okay, yeah, then we had kids. And everyone's like, oh, your kids will cure you of being night owls. Nope, we're just really dumb. We still stay up way too late. And then we have these three little monsters that come in and wake us up at 6 in the morning. And it's always remarkable to me, like, how creative they are at waking us up. Like, sometimes it's just like, cannonball, boom, right into bed. Sometimes it's like banging pots and pans, like, we need breakfast, bang, bang, bang. My favorite is the stare. I don't know if your kids do this, but my 4-year-old will just like, my face is like right here, and I'm sleeping, and she's just like, staring at me, you wake up, it's like, oh my, you're like the little girl from The Ring, like, all right, Norman Bates, take it easy, like, where did you learn that? But they're coming to us, and they're waking us up, and it drives us nuts. But, if I'm really honest, if I think about it just a little bit, the fact that our kids come to us when they're hungry, that's proof they trust us. Now, there's way more food at Food Lion down the street, but they're not jumping on their scooters at 6 in the morning and riding down to Food Lion. They're coming to mom and dad. And when my girls have nightmares, they have bad dreams, you know where they go? They don't run across the street to the neighbor. Our neighbor's like 6'8" and huge. He makes me look tiny. They don't go to that guy. They come to their daddy, and they hold on to me, and they tell me how they're feeling. And I love that. I love that because that reminds them that I am their caregiver. My wife and I, we care for them. We love them. We embrace them as they are. And maybe to kind of just put it like a different spin on that, like there's a book called Adopted for Life. It was written by Dr. Russell Moore. He's written a ton of books. But in this book, he's talking about his family's kind of journey through the adoption saga. And he travels to an orphanage in Russia. And he walks in, and he said it was one of the most surreal, kind of eerie experiences of his life because as he walks into this Russian orphanage, there's just crib after crib after crib of these little orphaned little girls and little boys, just row after row, hundreds of them, and it's silent. It's just quiet. And those children aren't quiet because they don't have any needs. They're quiet because they know no one cares. It doesn't matter how much they cry, no one's going to answer them. We have a God who loves to embrace us when we come to him with our doubts and our fears and our insecurities, and yes, even our pain, even our loss. It's proof of trust. Jesus said this in Matthew 18:3. He said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And a lot of times people hear that verse like, oh, we need to be innocent like little children. I don't know about your kids. My kids are not innocent. Or we need to be pure like little kids. Like we need to be, holy like little children. That's what it's about. You want to know the truth about kids? Can I go there with you guys today? Guys, kids are worthless. Hear me out. Here's what I mean by that. Like when you want a kickball team to win, you don't get a bunch of 4-year-olds, right? You just don't. And when you have projects around the house, like my daughter is terrible with a nail gun, no matter how much I have her try. No. Like projects don't get done when my children help. And when we tell them to clean up an area, it takes 4 times longer for them to clean because they're actually making more of a mess as the process goes. Like, and let's talk about artwork. Here, we just go there for a minute. Why not? Parents, your children's art is not that good. It's just not. I know you think Sally Sue is the next Rembrandt, but when you show me that picture that your daughter's doing, I'm like, oh, that's great. It's only missing one thing. Talent. Like, you're like, it's not that good. But you want to know what? We don't measure the value of children based on what they produce or what they achieve or what they accomplish or what they prove. Why do we value children? Man, they are precious to us. We care for them. We ache for them to come to us when they're hurting and in need. God loves when you come to him, not from a posture of arrogance and put togetherness and look what I've accomplished and look what I've done. Jesus says, come to me like little children. Have a relationship with me. Depend on me. And yes, that even means with your nightmares and your messes. Come to me like little children. Do you want to enter the kingdom of heaven? You've got to put the pretense aside. You've got to put it aside and say, I am on my own and I have to do this by myself, because that just isn't true. Lament is praise. Lament is proof of trust. You want to know what else lament is? Lament is a path to intimacy with God. When we set aside our posturing, when we set aside, here's my list of accomplishments and here's what I've done, and we actually just approach God with real and genuine need and desire to know him, you want to know what happens? He speaks to us. He speaks to us. The number one thing I hear as a pastor from people that they want to experience, they want to hear the voice of God in their life and for their life. And yet we approach God with such standoffishness. Look at me, I have this together. And that actually is one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons God actually allows us to experience pain. C.S. Lewis very famously said this, and it's in his book, The Problem of Pain, which is a fantastic book on this subject. He said this, he said, God whispers to us in our pleasure, but he shouts in our pain. It is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. God is speaking to you through that point of pain, that thing that you are bearing, that thing where it's so easy just to sweep under the rug and just say, I don't need to deal with this loss, this tragedy, I can put it aside. But you want to know what happens? It's like dropping a boulder on a geyser. Right, you can do that. That pressure's going somewhere. And it's going to start to seep out in other places of your life. And lament allows us to take that boulder off the geyser and just pour our hearts and our souls and our hurt out to God, and to be reminded that he is our Heavenly Father. He loves us and he is there for us, and we can experience his presence and his comfort in the midst of pain. Lament is praise. Lament is proof of trust. Lament is a path to intimacy with God. Hey, lament is participation in the suffering of others. When Jesus says you are blessed when you suffer and you will be comforted, what he's also speaking to is the fact that when you suffer, the places where you have been most hurt, the most anguished, you actually have the greatest opportunity to do the most good in the lives of others. We may not want to admit this, we may not want to acknowledge this, but as you are looking for a place to pour yourself out, those places where you are most afraid and most hurt, most insecure, are actually the places where you have the greatest opportunity to be a comfort in the life of others. There is something that happens to us when we go through loss or tragedy, or we experience bullying in school, or we experience failure to make a team, or we experience job loss. When those experiences accumulate in our lives, our hearts actually start to soften for someone else. I don't just sympathize with you for what you have gone with, I empathize with you. I can actually imagine, I can walk in your shoes because I have actually walked that path. And guys, I long for 7 Marks to be a kind of church like that, where we embrace people wholeheartedly, no matter the pain they've experienced. And we actually don't look at the pain and the loss and insecurities and the doubts of our lives as something we need to push to the side, but we actually say, God welcomes this, God empowers this, and there's actually the opportunity for us to even use that pain to find purpose. Do you want to know the most embracing, the most loving, the most kind, welcoming community on the face of the planet? It's not a government. It's not a company. It's not really even the church. go to an AA meeting. Go to an NA meeting. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. Go to an SA meeting. Sexaholics Anonymous. The community there has no pretense that they are put together, that they figured things out, but they are humble, they are eager, they want to embrace other people who are hurting. Last week I gave a young man a ride back to kind of his facility. He was going through the AA process, pursuing sobriety, and I was just talking to him, hearing his story, and I was just kind of offhand said, man, what are you most looking forward to, like, through this program? Like, what are you most looking forward to, like, gaining from this? I'm kind of a dumb question. It's like, oh, I don't know, sobriety? Like, I want to not be an alcoholic, or I want to be in recovery from alcoholism. But I loved his response. This is a young man, early 20s, just trying to get his life on track. He said, Joseph, you want to know the thing I'm most excited about? I cannot wait to be a sponsor. Man, I can't wait to be a sponsor. Because I have a sponsor speaking into my life right now. I have people speaking into my life and sharing from their hurt and their experiences and allowing me to participate and learn from what they have gone through. He's like, I can't wait. I cannot wait to turn the page on my story and for that to be how I can comfort others. Lament allows us to participate in the hurting places of the world and honestly the hurting places in other people's lives. And I do want to say this really fast because pain can be awkward. Like when other people are suffering, when people are hurting, I don't know if this is a North America thing, maybe it's just a people thing, but we often feel really uncomfortable meeting other people in their place of hurt. You want food? No? Okay, let me know what you need. Like, we don't know what to do. And so we get so wrapped up. I need to say the right thing. I need to do the right thing. I need to have the answers. Because if I don't have the answers, I can't really sit with, I can't really meet with and love someone really well. I love this quote by Maya Angelou, though, because it strikes right at the heart of that. She says this, I have learned that people will forget what you said. And people will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. When in doubt, there's something called the ministry of presence, of simply sitting and grieving, lamenting alongside someone who is hurting. Job is a famous book of the Bible. If you've been around the church a little bit, you've heard the story of Job. You've heard this faithful man who lost everything, lost his family, lost his wealth, he lost his health, and he's just grieving. And Job's friends show up, and they say all kinds of dumb stuff, wrong stuff, trying to comfort him because they don't really know what to say. But I actually want to know the right thing that Job's friends did. When they showed up with him, and he's grieving, and he's sitting on the ground, and he's hurting, and he's weeping over his loss, it says that Job's friends just sat with him. It says his friends sat with him for 7 days and just grieved with him. Friends, don't be afraid of just sitting with someone who is hurting. You don't have to have the answers. Can I be honest? You probably don't have the answers. You probably won't. And even if you do have the answers, man, it's not always going to be the most satisfying. When people are hurting, they're not looking for theological precision. That's a good thing. We should care about that. When people are hurting, they just want to know you care and you're there for them. But I want to end with this. Guys, lament is not our final prayer. And this is really good news. This is actually the best news because it is a tool, it is a practice that God wants us to embrace in a hurting world to help care for hurting people. But man, it is not the final prayer. That candle you're holding on to, and you only hold on to it just long enough so the lights come back on, right? You can put that thing out. Hey, the light is coming back on. We have confidence in how the story will end because of the cross, because of Jesus. Because of the empty tomb. We know how the story ends, and we can say, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I won't fear any evil. My God is with me, and I know how the story ends. The God of hope, the God of comfort, is making all things new. And even though we hurt now, and even though this side of eternity we don't have the answers that we maybe want, even feel like we're entitled to or deserve, the day is coming. You want to know what's going to happen? With all your pain and all your loss, like that couple on a mountaintop as they're just processing their grief before God and before an open world, one day they're going to stand before Jesus. You want to know what he's going to do? It says that he's going to wipe every tear from their eyes. And you hear how how intimate that is, how near that is. God is near to the brokenhearted. So we grieve. We lament. There's real suffering in the world, but we do not grieve like those who do not have hope, because we know how the story ends.